So we're going to get a bit of a, excuse me, more balanced picture of India under Islamic rule. Last class we mentioned some of the darker side of it. There were other things going on. There was a very important aspect of the Islamic presence in India, which was the sort of mystic, devotional side of Islam, the Sufi tradition. I want to say a bit about Sufism. The Muslim attempt to convert the people of India in general was not successful in the sense that India remained a very strongly majority Hindu culture. But there was some success. I mean, there was success in different places, and especially in Bengal and Punjab, which are, interestingly, when India was divided after World War II, and India became independent, there was a partition. And the colony was divided into India and Pakistan. Pakistan was basically composed of Punjab and East Bengal, which is now known as Bangladesh. And so if you know India, I mean, Punjab, of course, is way in the northwest, and then Bengal is down in the east central part. So at first, I don't know if you guys all know the history. Everyone, I mean, it's a little before your time, but after partition, Pakistan actually was composed of two parts, West and East Pakistan. West Pakistan was basically the Punjab, or part of the Punjab. There's still an Indian state called Punjab. And East Bangladesh, and then in the Bangladesh War, which George Harrison and his friends, Bob Dylan, did a concert to raise funds for all the victims of that. Anyway, during the Bangladesh War, Bangladesh became independent, and became Bangladesh. But the Muslim conversions were more successful in Punjab and Bangladesh, and one of the reasons was the presence of the Sufis. In other words, it wasn't all coercive conversion. Part of it was simply due to the success of Sufi preachers. So I want to say a bit about Sufism because it was an important aspect of the Islamic presence in India. So first, here are some definitions given from the 9th and 10th centuries when Sufism was really getting going, even outside India. These are different definitions by Sufi practitioners of what Sufism really, what the essence of it is. So a gentleman named Junaid said that Sufism is that you should be with God without any attachment. And Ruwaym ibn Ahmad said Sufism consists of abandoning oneself to God in accordance with what God wills. Samnun, Sufism is that you should not possess anything, nor should anything possess you. Abu Muhammad al-Jariri said Sufism consists of entering every exalted quality and leaving behind every despicable quality. Amir ibn Uthman al-Makki, Sufism is that at each moment the servant should be in accord with what is most appropriate at that moment. Ali ibn Sufism consists of extending the spiritual station and being in constant union with God. So all these definitions were provided by al-Sarraj, who lived around 988. And the earliest comprehensive book on Sufism, the Kitab al-Luma. An old friend of mine, a Dr. Godless, he always jokes about his name, Godless, because he's actually kind of a spiritually minded person. But anyway, he teaches at the University of Georgia, which is, that's another state, just north of Florida. And so he's, I think, himself a Sufi practitioner, and he also teaches it. So here's what he says about it. Sufism, or Tasawwuf, as it is called in Arabic, is generally understood by scholars and Sufis to be the inner, mystical, or psycho-spiritual dimension of Islam. Today, however, many Muslims and non-Muslims believe that Sufism is outside the sphere of Islam. So there's always been a tension because Sufism tended to be non-dogmatic, non-fanatical. They tended to be learned. They tended to be spiritually minded, to look for the universal, the one in everything, devotion to God. And so there's always a tension between Sufis and you could say the so-called born-again fanatical Muslims. Just as there is in fact a tension throughout Christian history between Christians who tended to be more philosophical, more universalistic, and to talk about the Christ in everyone or whatever, and those who were dogmatic and fanatical. You found the same thing in Buddhism. So practically you could conclude that probably in every religion that's been around long enough and has enough people in it so that you get a broad spectrum, that you tend to get certain dogmatic, fundamentalist people who say this is the only thing, it has to be exactly according to their interpretation. Other people that tend to look for the unity of human religion and try to find the presence of their God in everyone, even in other traditions. And the same tension was definitely there in Islam. It's sort of a universal thing, and you find it especially between the Sufis. In fact, Sufis at different times were violently persecuted within Islam. And with the rise of a type of fanatical, fundamentalist Islam after the Wahhabi revolution around 200 years ago, there was a lot of persecution of Sufism, and their status is still uneven. It depends on what country, whether you're talking about Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Iraq or here or there or Indonesia. So there's always been this tension. There's always been this tension between, you okay? This tension between the Sufis and more fundamentalist, fanatical, dogmatic Muslims. And of course, for the most part, the Sufis try to keep a good relationship with the Islamic powers, and but there's always a tension. They're always if you think about Christian history, where, for example, Francis of Assisi was called to the Vatican, like, what are you doing out there? And then he had to explain himself, and the Pope decided, who knows, for various spiritual or political or whatever reasons he had, to include Francis. So if you look at the history of Christianity, you always have people who get a little too mystical or too spiritual, and they're sort of called back to Rome to explain themselves, and sometimes they're included, and sometimes they are excommunicated. There was a gentleman named Meister Eckhart, who's one of the famous Christian mystics in the Middle Ages, who got into a type of Vedantic thing. It's all one, and a lot of people were very upset about that. If you look at the early history of Christianity, there were people like Origen, who believed in reincarnation, and there were many martyrs. There were actually many martyrs in Christian history who basically were just kind of liberal-minded people that wanted to be more tolerant and got burned alive for it. So there always tends to be this tension you can see throughout religions. Anyway, Sufism. Today, however, many Muslims and non-Muslims believe that Sufism is outside the sphere of Islam. Nevertheless, Sayyid Hossein Nasr, one of the foremost scholars of Islam, in his article, The Interior Life in Islam, contends that Sufism is simply the name for the inner or esoteric dimension of Islam. And then Dr. Godless says, after nearly 30 years of the study of Sufism, I would say that in spite of its many variations and voluminous expressions, the essence of Sufi practice is quite simple. It is that the Sufi surrenders to God in love over and over, which involves embracing with love at each moment the content of one's consciousness, one's perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, as well as one's sense of self, as gifts of God, or more precisely as the manifestations of God. I visited a Sufi community, which is all Western Sufis, and Americans and Europeans, outside Bedford, Virginia. Actually, I was invited by Dr. Godless to visit that community, and it was very interesting. So, anyway, Sufism. So that was going on. Sufism was always there, and so when you have this extremely violent political presence of Islam in India, there also are some Sufis who come and have a different way of looking at it. I mean, if you think, I don't know if you've seen that movie, I think it's called La Misión, originally in Spanish, about the Jesuits in Argentina. There was a tremendous conflict at times between Jesuit missionaries who were almost like the cultural anthropologists of their day and who were sympathetic to indigenous peoples in North and South America, and then there were the Spanish governors who just wanted to enslave the local people, whereas the Jesuits at times wanted to save their souls and actually saw some value in their culture, and at times La Cruz y la Espada the cross and the sword at times, the Spanish governors would kill the Jesuits when they got a little too flaky and liberal and cross-cultural. So you see this very clearly in this relationship between the Spanish crown and the Jesuit missionaries, who often were sympathetic to the indigenous peoples. Then you had that kind of tension in India. Also, another thing that was going on is that there were certain people, one of the most famous is Kabir, a poet, who was born in the early 15th century from a weaver caste, which was pretty down the totem pole. A weaver caste that was not, that was pretty low. But he was born there. And a lot of people in his caste had converted to Islam, but apparently he had some type of Hindu guru, and he thought, like, what's everybody fighting about? So he was, even before the Mughals came in, he was sort of a syncretist. He wanted everyone to just sort of get together, same God. Like, what's the problem? So here's a typical poem in which, anyway, you can see for yourself. This is a poem by Kabir. He's very famous. He's one of the most famous poets in Indian history. O seeker, where are all you looking for me? O seekers. In other words, this is God speaking. Where are you all looking for me? I am right with you. I am not to be found in mosques, temples, the Kaaba in Mecca, or Kailas, the mountain of Shiva, nor am I found through rituals, prayers, austerities, or dispassion. If you just look with sincerity, you will see me in an instant, this very instant. Kabir says, Holy One, know that the Lord is the essence of breath itself. So this is Kabir. And we're going to talk a little later about another movement, a very important movement in Indian history. Basically it was teaching like, let's not fight over religion, there's just one God. And this movement is the Sikh movement, Sikhism. And ironically, this movement, which began, Guru Nanak, sort of a non-denominational sage, it began with this spirit of uniting Hinduism and Islam and saying, come on, it's all the same God. And they ended up engaged in a very violent series of battles and wars with the Mughals. Ironically, they came to a certain point in their history, the Sikhs, where they had to choose to become totally non-political and just sort of, the life of the humble sage, or they had to militarize, politicize, and go to war, and they chose to militarize and go to war. But anyway, it's a very interesting case study of the different routes that religions take in history. But in any case, Kabir, in the 15th century, and he's not the only one, is calling for ecumenicalism. He's calling for harmony. Let's all just get together, everybody. There's only one God. And ultimately, one of perhaps the two most famous kings in Indian history, who was a Muslim ruler, Akbar the Great, who was considered one of the greatest kings in Indian history, also be a great syncretist. We'll talk about him. So this is kind of the climate. Now, one thing I should mention before we get into the Mughal history, we're actually going to go through the history of who these Mughals were. Just as when there was this challenge of the Shramana movement, people going out to nature and challenging the efficacy and the necessity of all these elaborate fire sacrifices and rituals and rigid caste hierarchy. And the Vedic tradition kind of had to go back, retool, reinvent itself, and find within itself resources to deal with that, which it did, because it found in the Vedas, in the Vedanta, in the Upanishads, and in the devotional traditions that they did have this powerful, eloquent emphasis on the oneness of all people, above and beyond caste distinctions, and the importance of spirituality over ritual, and the importance of nonviolence and compassion. And so all these resources were there, and they had to go back and find them. And so in that sense, it was sort of a positive stimulus, this challenge of the Shramana movements. So in the same way, we're sort of beginning now well, we're past this halfway mark in the semester, but this is the second great dialectic, you could say, in Indian history, and that is you have the original Vedic culture, the challenge of the Shramana movements, Buddhism, Jainism, and then kind of a synthesis in which Hinduism reinvented itself, Buddhism, incorporating a lot of the most attractive features of Buddhism and Jainism and other movements. And then the result was that Buddhism kind of found it had less and less to argue about with Hinduism, became more and more like Hinduism. Jainism kind of stuck to their guns and became a very tiny minority religion. And so you had a kind of consensus, a synthesis and a consensus. And everybody was kind of culturally on board, even though there was a great diversity of approaches. But they all shared a lot of the same general cultural assumptions. So then this is going on. Okay, everybody's happy. And in the midst of this consensus, you have this violent invasion. And so it's a brand new dialectic ballgame. Suddenly, that's what dialectic means. A synthesis becomes the thesis. Now you have this violent antithesis, and there's going to be a new synthesis, which will become, you could say, modern India. In any case, there are three very important Middle Eastern religions that came from the Middle East, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which sort of define themselves as monotheistic. And as we pointed out, the Bhagavad Gita is very strongly monotheistic, very adamantly monotheistic, but at the same time, it recognizes a plurality of divine beings under a supreme God. Interestingly, the same way the Old Testament recognizes this, although the followers tended to overlook that. It's even in the first commandment, by the way, you shall know their gods before me. Not, as Paul said, the gods don't exist, but that you shouldn't put them above the supreme God. But in any case, so in Islam, often the greatest offense is considered to be, maybe you know how to pronounce this better than me, shirk, which is to in any way compromise monotheism, or to attribute divine qualities to someone else. There's only one God. So it's a very stringent, sort of a severe monotheism. And again, we talked about the Sufi tradition, which is, I think you could say, one of the great spiritual and mystic traditions in human history, and which, in a sense, had a much more cosmopolitan and even eclectic way of looking at things. And there was always this tension between the Sufis and the more fundamentalist wing. In any case, so you can imagine the Muslims coming to India and finding this, what appeared to them to be this jungle of polytheistic and idolatrous stuff going on. It was just like, it's very interesting because this stuff was originally going on in Europe too, by the way. And in Europe, when it went on in Europe, it was called, well, paganism. That's what the Christians called it. And so if you look at European paganism, pre-Christian Europe, it's very similar, by the way, to Vedic culture. It's actually very similar. And it's no coincidence that there is an Indo-European proto-civilization. I mean, an original Indo-European civilization. And if you look at pre-Christian Europe and pagan and Vedic India, they're very similar in many ways. Just as our languages come from the same family, it's obvious that these cultures are coming from an original culture. So now, when Christianity took over Europe, and they somewhat brutally repressed the pagan tradition, doing all the good things that people do, like destroying pagan temples and persecuting priests and sort of wiping out all the traces. They tried to wipe out it. Of course, they couldn't really wipe it out, so that's why we still have Halloween, for example. Anyway, so, but basically the Christians, doing their sort of extreme makeover of Europe and getting rid of as much of pagan culture as they could. So you could say that from this great Indo-European civilization, the sort of the last remaining bastion of this proto-historical Indo-European civilization was India. Because you had this Indo-European civilization, and then you had these Middle Eastern traditions. So one Middle Eastern tradition, Christianity, took over Europe and kind of did an extreme makeover, which lasted until the Renaissance, by the way, because the Renaissance, the rebirth, is a rebirth of pagan culture. That's why that means the rebirth of what? Of paganism, basically. So with the collapse of the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages and all that, you had Christendom. In the Middle Ages, Europe was the kingdom of Christ on earth. At a certain point, as Europe started to become a little more culturally developed, they started to rediscover some of this old classical Greek philosophy and Roman stuff, and they said, and so the intellectuals in Europe, who were basically monks in monasteries, started to think, hey, this is really pretty good stuff. These people were pretty bright. I mean, Aristotle, that guy had a head on his shoulders, and Plato, Plato, after all, was the intellectual guru, philosophical guru of Augustine. Augustine was the main philosopher in the Middle Ages in Christian Europe. And Augustine was really into Plato. And then Thomas Aquinas, who became the official theologian of the church, was really into Aristotle. And so the fact is that classical civilization was very impressive in many ways. Not in all ways, but in many ways in terms of literature, philosophy, art, sculpture. No one's really equal to their sculpture, and some people think no one's equal to their philosophy. So anyway, so the Renaissance rebirthed that classical civilization within still a Christian context, and then gradually the rise of secularism. But in India, you have the original, unashamed, unmitigated paganism. Full-on, pre-Christian, pre-Islamic, Indo-European paganism all the way, full throttle. And so when the Muslims came into India, it was like, oh my God. So, but now Sufism, by the way, was influenced by Indian devotionalism, was influenced by the Bhakti movements. At the same time, with this challenge, because the Islamic challenge in India was not only military or political. There were very bright Muslim people that came to India. There were philosophers. There were people, I think, by any normal definition, you have to say were serious spiritual practitioners, very devoted to God. And they spiritually challenged India. And again, just as the Vedic culture responded to the Shramana challenge by sort of, what have we got to deal with this? In the same way from this Islamic challenge, which was really, in a sense, the challenge of Middle Eastern monotheism, the Bhakti movements responded very powerfully and began to emphasize their own monotheistic aspect, because that was the big Islamic thing. That was the big Christian. Well, in terms of Christian monotheism, interestingly enough, when Islam first began to rise, they actually challenged Christianity and converted a lot of Christians to Islam, arguing that in their Trinity doctrine, Christians had actually given up monotheism. And that's a whole discussion I'm not really being paid to give you right now, but the Trinity, the rise of the Trinity doctrine and where that comes from, and maybe, anyway, some other time. But in any case, Islam felt that it was actually defending the real spirit of the Abrahamic religions. It was defending the revelation of God to Abraham, to Adam, you could say, that had been compromised and distorted by Christian Trinitarianism, with their idea that there are actually three people who are God. In any case, in response to this Islamic challenge, the Bhakti traditions really began to say, hey, we've got the Bhagavad Gita. This is full-on monotheism. And so it's very interesting. So in some ways, apart from the military brutality and the political stuff and all that, there was a very interesting cultural exchange going on, which in some ways actually enriched everybody. So, it wasn't just all dark. And because Islam, what's going to happen with the Mughals, basically, by the time we get to Humayun and Akbar, well, let's go into the Mughal history, and you'll see that, in a sense, with the Mughals, you start to get a different kind of Islam in India, and one which really has very powerful influence in shaping modern India. So any questions on that so far? Yes?
Are there any distinct differences that you can think of between Sufism and Bhakti traditions?
Well, the Sufis, who were just like again, it's like the Jesuits and the Spanish crown, they were always in tension with fundamentalist Islamic hierarchy, or powers, or kings, and so on. And they tried to stay within the boundaries of Islam. In many ways, they're similar. Spiritually, they're often very similar. And in fact, if you look at the Sufi tradition, They developed their own paramparas, their successions of gurus and disciples. They had samadhis, the common, like the word samadhi means in yoga trance, but the word samadhi in Hinduism also means a memorial shrine. When you bury someone, when you bury a great saint, and you build a little shrine, a samadhi, and then people go and visit that samadhi, try to get the blessings of that saint. That's something you find in all world religions. I mean, every world religion has this, that you visit the burial shrine of a great saint. So the Sufis really took on all the different aspects of bhakti. And of course, it's not they borrowed everything, they brought some things also. I mean, they certainly did kirtan and bhajan, the chanting, and they had gurus and disciples, they had sampradayas, parampara, they had successions of gurus and disciples, they had samadhis. So they were, it was a sophisticated devotional tradition, which in many ways was similar to the Bhakti traditions. But of course they tried to stay within the Islamic boundaries. If they didn't, those Sufis that didn't, of course, stopped being Sufis. They just became something else. But Sufism in general chose to remain within Islam, although despite their attempts, they were often persecuted. Yes?
Well, you sort of point out, there were like Sufis that kind of said it was the boundary for this one, and it became very because
Yeah. No, they were. I mean, some of them were definitely universal spiritual teachers who appealed to basically to all kinds of people from many different religions. I think some of them, they're actually quite inspiring. So Sufism has, I mean, according to any sort of even sociological definition of what a saint is, there have definitely been a number of very important saints in that tradition and very impressive spiritual teachers who had very wide appeal. And still do, actually. So, the Mughals. So in 1526, a gentleman named Babar, who was from Central Asia, Samarkand, and he was involved in all these internecine dynastic struggles in Central Asia, and basically he lost. He was trying to take back his ancestral land, Samarkand, against other Muslim rulers, and he lost. And so he had to conquer something, right? So he thought, well, why not India? So at that point in Delhi, the Delhi rulers were always killing each other anyway. They were kind of, he felt this is a good moment, like they're not at their strongest right now. He came down and he actually beat them. So he took over in Delhi. He wasn't ruling all of India at this point, but he did take over in Delhi. Now, he only ruled for several years before he died. He had to fight this Rajput coalition. He had artillery. You see, again, what I wanted to say is that Islam, to some extent, was in touch with Europe. And so when Islam came into India, it wasn't only Islam. It was kind of like the first wave of certain Western things coming in. And as we'll see, very early on, or halfway through the Mughal rule, the Europeans start to come to India. But they're still on the coast. They're not coming inland very much yet. In any case, Babar had artillery, nobody else did, and he literally blew away his enemies. He had this huge technological advantage. Basically, he died after a few years, and his son was an infant, Humayun. And so one of his ministers, Sher Khan was like the tiger killer. He apparently killed a tiger by himself. Sher means tiger, right? So he took over. He usurped the throne, Sher Khan. And apparently he's a very good administrator. He built this fabulous road from Punjab to Bengal, basically from the top of India all the way to almost to the Bay of Bengal, which later became the Great Trunk Road, which was sort of immortalized in poetry by Rudyard Kipling. He built towns. He was really practical. Trade, manufacturing, new towns, good roads, infrastructure. He was, so anyway, he was there for a while. Then he was laying siege to one fort. There was an accidental explosion and he died. Now, what about his son Humayun? Humayun, who was the son of Babar, had to flee. He was just an infant, but his mother fled to save their lives. And interestingly, they went to Persia. Now, Persia, unlike Central Asia, was culturally very sophisticated. something that the Iranians are hoping someday the Americans will get, that they actually have their own great culture. Anyway, so when he went to Persia, the Persians, of course, were Shiites. And the rulers of India had been fanatical Sunnis. Fanatical Sunnis. I assume you know the distinction of Sunnis and the Shiites. Right? You all know that? So anyway, now interestingly, although Humayun was a Sunni, he was protected by Shiites in Persia. He was raised by a Shiite guardian, and he even sort of outwardly converted to Shiite because, he was living in the middle of the Persian Empire. He said that, yeah, if you guys support me, when I go back to India and I take over my father's kingdom again, we'll preach Shiite Islam, which he didn't really do. But at least it made enough influence. It had enough, and so when he was in exile, he had a son in exile. This son was Akbar the Great, who, along with Ashok, is probably one of the two most beloved and celebrated kings in Indian history. Interestingly, neither Hindu. I mean, you have Ram, of course, who's the great Vedic ruler, but Ashok, who wasn't really a Buddhist, but he patronized Buddhism, and then Akbar, who was a Mughal, Muslim, but still very much loved as one of the great rulers of Indian history. So anyway, Akbar was just a child, and Akbar was also raised by these Persians, and Akbar had this memory that although he was from the Sunni community, and he was surrounded when he eventually became emperor by fanatical Sunnis, that he had actually been raised and helped by Shiites. And so he was sort of ecumenical. He had a different way, because he grew up in Persia up to the time he was 13, and even Humayun, they had a different view. They weren't coming from this tough, sort of fanatical, Central Asian wilderness. He wasn't coming from that. They were coming from this sophisticated Persian milieu with a different view. Anyway, so Humayun returned. He was victorious. He took back over his father's kingdom. Sher Khan was dead. And then Humayun, one day there was a call to prayer, his Muslim call to prayer. He was in his library, so he didn't want to be late for the prayer, so he ran out of his library, tripped on the stairs, fell, and basically killed himself. He died, tripping on the stairs of his library trying to get to the prayer on time. Mm-hmm. So at that time, Akbar was 13 years old, and now suddenly he becomes the emperor. And this is, by the way, so Humayun died in 1556. Akbar is 13 years old. He takes over. He did extensive military campaigning. He wanted to consolidate the Mughal rule. He conquered practically all of North India, even in 1572, Gujarat. Do you know where that is? West India. But then he actually, from the beginning, he had this spirit. He wanted to bring everyone together. Akbar really wanted to unite everyone. Again, he's really an Indian now. He really thinks that he's an Indian. And it's just like nowadays. Think of typical American politicians. Like whatever their personal religion is. I mean, all the modern presidents and so on. They'll light a little menorah on Hanukkah, or they'll welcome to the White House people from, some Muslims or even Hindus. And it's just the American spirit. If you're a politician, you have to respect all the religions. In that sense, Akbar was a very modern politician. And he very much had the spirit. He married a Hindu wife, a Rajput. This is Delhi right here. The next big state over is Rajasthan, where you get these very fierce warriors who resisted Akbar. And actually, Akbar had the hardest time ever conquering these people. And finally made alliance with them. And there was a kind of coalition with him as the emperor. These Rajput princes, many of them had come from the old Hun invasions and other Central Asians. So they themselves, although they were Hindus, before the entrance of Islam in India, there had been other Central Asian invasions. But unlike the Muslim invaders, they all converted to Hinduism. So there's a whole history going way back, long before the Muslims, of these fierce Central Asian steppes, these fierce Central Asians coming down into India, conquering this or that. And before the Muslims, they all just were assimilated into the local culture. They became Hindus. And so here in Rajasthan, here's Delhi, here's Rajasthan, you got these very fierce warriors called Rajputs, which is from Sanskrit Rajaputra, which means prince, son of the king, and who were one of the great military powers because they were descendants of these old Central Asian warriors that had come down into India. So anyway, Akbar married a princess from that group in 1562, actually 6 years after he took the throne. He's only 19 years old. I guess, why must he be a teenager in love? I think that's an old pop song. So, at the age of 19, he married this Rajasthani princess, Jodhabai. And on in the capital city, he built her a Hindu mandir, a temple. So this is not a fanatical guy. Akbar, his heart, his spirit is really, he's just Indian. He wants everyone to live together in peace. He marries a Hindu princess and builds her a temple. I mean, think back of Solomon in Israel, the old, the original Solomon, who married a Gentile princess and built her a pagan temple on his palace grounds. So it's interesting. I mean, there's a whole history of this type of diversity. So, for example, Akbar's revenue minister, Raja Todarmal, developed this brilliant revenue system, tax, financial system, which even the British used in most of India, because it was just such a clever system. So Akbar gave religious freedom for all his subjects. He remembered how his father had been helped by the Shiites. And then he would stay up Friday nights. Friday night was sort of religion night. So on Friday nights he would invite sages or leaders of all the different religions, all the different Hindu groups, Catholic priests, a few of them were even around at the time, and of course Sunnis, Shiites, Sufis, and they would stay up all night and discuss religion. They would have debates. They wouldn't fight each other. So he would gather all these religious leaders and have kind of like these ecumenical or interreligious debates and discussions and so on. And by 1579, he made a declaration that he would act as the final arbiter in religious disputes. So he was really into religion. And finally, he in 1582, he started his own religion. Because he wanted to unite all the religions. That was his dream, that let's just have one religion, let's unite everybody. So again, this is a very different side of the Islamic presence in India. His religion was called Deen-e-Ilahi, so I hope I pronounced more or less right, divine faith. The divine faith, it was quote-unquote Sufi in conception, monotheistic. It had Shiite ideas of the role of the Mujtahid, the interpreter of the faith. It had Zoroastrian ceremonial expressions. And ultimately, he was really into Hinduism also. For example, Akbar banned the slaughter of cows in the capital. You couldn't kill a cow in the capital under Akbar. Because, again, this Hindu, you could say Buddhist or even Jain principle of ahimsa, nonviolence. So he stopped animal killing in the capital. He himself gave up meat eating 2 days of the week, trying. And during major Hindu festivals, he wouldn't eat meat out of respect for Hinduism. So Akbar, he's called Akbar the Great. He was, he started his own ecumenical religion. He wanted to unite all religions. He used to stay up at night talking to sages and so on. Very interesting character, and again, very much loved and very much celebrated in Indian history, basically by all Indians. Now, what happens when he dies? Okay, let's go a little briefly here. His son is Jahangir. Basically maintained, now we're going to get two very romantic Mughal rulers, as we'll see. Akbar's son, and again, usually they take power by killing all their rivals. That was just kind of like, business as usual. So Jahangir took over, maintained his father's policy. For example, suspending any special taxes on non-Muslims. And just so he maintained the same ecumenical spirit as his father. But he came under the control of his Muslim wife, the dynamic Nur Jahan. He officially granted her the right to rule, issued new gold coins in her name. And on the flip side of the coin, this is what he wrote. These were the gold coins. By order of the king Jahangir, gold has 100 splendors added to it by receiving the impression of the name of Nur Jahan, the queen. And then her seal was added to his on all imperial orders. So basically, he was a very romantic alcoholic, and he had a very powerful wife who essentially ruled the empire. Now, his son was, yes.
Sorry, what was the name of his wife?
Oh, Nur Jahan. I should have written her name. His son, Shah Jahan, was also very even more romantic. He built the Taj Mahal. Shah Jahan, where does he go? Here he is. Built the Taj Mahal for Mumtaz. Now, Nur Jahan had a brother, and her brother's daughter is called, among other things, Mumtaz. And Shah Jahan married her and built her. And when she died, he was so heartbroken, he built the Taj Mahal as her memorial. And he would visit it every day. He worshipped his late wife. He worshipped her. Now, his son is the bad guy. Aurangzeb is the real bad guy. He's the exact opposite. Here's a quote from a history book. Aurangzeb proved to be the exact antithesis of his great-grandfather Akbar. The exact antithesis. He completely abandoned secularism, which was the basis of Akbar's spectacular success. Instead, beginning in the year following his first coronation, Aurangzeb issued ordinances openly promoting Islamic orthodoxy at court, vowing to rule strictly as a Muslim king, basically declared war on. He said during his long rule of a half-century, Aurangzeb openly declared war against the Hindus, reversing his great-grandfather's policy of tolerance. Aurangzeb's reign was marred by the destruction of temples. I've seen actually many of these temples in India. If you go to Vrindavan, the land of Krishna, you can see many temples that were desecrated by Aurangzeb.
That was done by him, a lot of those?
Oh yeah, that was Aurangi. And a general intolerance toward people of non-Muslim, non-Sunni faiths. For the first time in a century since it was abolished by Akbar in 1564, the hated jizya tax on non-Muslims was reinstated. So, interestingly, Akbar had a brother named Dara. This was his oldest brother, Dara. And Shah Jahan, had originally left his throne to his eldest son, Dara, who's a very interesting character. Dara was well-read in philosophy and mysticism, both Hindu and Sufi, wanted to embrace Hindu beliefs without abandoning Islam. He's the exact opposite of his brother. He's sort of like almost typical of the Sufis. He wanted to really embrace a lot of this Hindu wisdom, but stay within Islam. This guy Dara, a great-grandson of Akbar, he translated from Sanskrit 52 Upanishads into Persian, regarded them as, quote, a treasure of monotheism. Following Akbar, he assembled Hindu scholars and ascetics in Benares to discuss, quote, every sublime topic which he had desired or thought and had looked for and not found. And he declared, this guy Dara, that those who read his Upanishad translations, quote, shall become imperishable, fearless, and eternally liberated. Dara. D-A-R-A. So, Aurangzeb naturally killed him. So it's very interesting. I mean, if you look at Dara and Aurangzeb, you really get the full spectrum. You have this fanatical, murderous Aurangzeb, who's like almost like a Hitler-type figure in Indian history. You know, declaring war against the Hindus, destroying temples, persecuting people. He was always at war. Actually, his rule goes up into these are the years of his reign. And he was constantly at war. Basically, he was just at war with everyone. He was a good general, but he totally overextended himself. There were all kinds of resistance movements. There was a very famous uprising, resistance movement in Maharashtra, led by Shivaji. He's one of the great heroes in Indian history. And so Aurangzeb spent his entire reign just sort of fighting everyone. And the result of this was that when he died, the Mughal Empire fell apart. Because, I mean, when you overreach, when you overextend yourself, you end up weakening yourself. I won't give analogies from recent American history, but so Aurangzeb is the last great Mughal ruler, at war with everyone, fighting everyone, persecuting everyone, and basically destroying the Mughal Empire, which people like Akbar had built based on alliances, coalitions, bringing people in, much like, can't help throw out this historical analogy, if you study the history of the Roman conquest of Italy, starting from the city of Rome, and how they conquered Italy, it's very similar. They were team builders, very interesting. That was sort of Rome at its best. Anyway, so by this time, by the way, there's a group of people in India that are kind of watching all of this. They're watching Aurangzeb. And notice that he's alienated everyone, totally, just fracturing the country, creating conflict everywhere. And here's a real opportunity for someone to come in and recreate unity. And the people who are watching all this and thinking about this are called the Europeans, especially the English. They're watching all this. And they're going to make their move. And that's something we'll talk about, how they make their move when they see all this going on with the Mughals. But again, if you look at Dara and Aurangzeb, Dara, who translated 52 Upanishads, who felt that people who read his translations of the Upanishads would become immortal, eternally liberated, and then Aurangzeb was just a wild-eyed, violent fanatic. And so I think this gives the picture that there were all kinds of different people. Some of them saints, some of them fanatics, some of them very wise, some of them very ignorant. And anyway, so we'll end here for now.